that's better. Okay, we're going to go ahead and jump in. If people join us afterwards, they will be able to watch the full recording. But we want to start off by thanking Compass Education Group for sponsoring our new counselor webinar series this year, and we are grateful for their generosity. Before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know this topic was kind of born out of a conversation that we had as a faculty as we were planning topics earlier this year around different identities that students may have. And in the past, this session was only, or this webinar was only highlighting international students. And we were talking about what are the other groups who may need extra support through this process that we could also hit on. So the Counseling Outside the Majority presentation was created, and we're super excited to offer it this month. With the recording that you'll receive after this month's webinar, you'll receive kind of a document of resources that kind of touch on all of the different groups that we'll be talking about today. So hopefully that will be helpful to you currently and in the future should you need it. Much of what you'll hear today can be applied across different groups, ones that you will be hearing today and ones that we're not touching on. Our hope is that this webinar sparked some conversations among you in the college counseling office and on your campus about ways to support students who often are outside of kind of, the majority of the college counseling process. And we think it's really helpful for you and other people in your office to consider the identities of students that maybe are visible, invisible, innate, chosen, socially valued, socially marginalized, and who is considered normal and othered. Obviously, this varies from year to year, from school to school, from region to region. It's going to look very different from me here in Austin, Texas, versus someone in a different part of the country or the world. So that's something that we just kind of wanted to use as kind of a grounding statement. But as counselors, we may find ourselves as part of the dominant or more privileged group, or as members of the more marginalized groups in this process. And that may influence some of the work that we do and the conversations and some of the tensions that we feel throughout this process, working with students and colleges and universities, and how it affects our day-to-day life. We want to engage in this conversation because as in independent schools, we work with individuals and communities from different spaces. And it's really important that we're able to support all of our students, regardless of where they are. But it's important to recognize that students from more minoritized identities may need extra support and are often overlooked. What does this look like in independent schools? We serve different community members. Obviously, we have students from across different parts of our city or our town, oftentimes from the US and the world, coming to our campuses for educational opportunities. So we need to be prepared to serve them. Understanding this in the admissions world, some of this can affect students' identities, can affect the way that they look at schools to research and their overall applications that they eventually submit. For students who are looking for places that offer support in helping them with either learning differences or background support, that is something that students may be looking for, and it's incumbent on us to offer ways to help them find those places as we help them. Students may also feel the need to identify certain things in their college essays. This is something that may be done on an individual basis with students in conversations with you, but it may be important for students to share some aspects of their identity in their college essays pertaining to some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today. And then also academic advising for students, how and where we're placing students, maybe with different backgrounds or identities. can impact their college admissions in terms of schools that they have access to, classes each year that they have access to. So this is once again something that we all need to be aware of, and something that we should be able to talk about as a college counseling office and as a school in general. So those are some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. And once again, we'll leave some time at the end for questions, which we hope you will have some. But I'm going to turn it over to Joaquin, who's going to take it over now.
Sorry, before we go on,
Yeah.
Chad, would you be able to reshare your screen? I'm not seeing the PowerPoint.
Oh, no. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying something. Um,
All right.
okay. Can you guys see that?
Perfect. There we go.
Oh,
Can we go one slide back? Perfect.
yeah.
So again, my name is Joaquin Hamilton. I'm coming to you from Germantown Academy, which is an independent school out in Fort Washington, PA, maybe right outside of Philadelphia. So, I'm so glad that we decided to bring up this topic, or decided to expand this topic this year. For me, our conversation really kind of lay heavy on discussing students from BIPOC backgrounds or BIPOC identities. So we're talking about Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So for me, I think in my experience, working with students, I a lot of times lean into my own identities. And in this particular case, a lot of my identity pieces overlap. I don't try to make any assumptions that my experience is their experience. I try to lean in with a lot of questions to just make sure I have a clear perspective on how they experience my campus. My campus is a predominantly white campus. Our student population, students of color, obviously are here, are around, but how they kind of engage with the community, the mission statement, and even the academic curriculum sometimes is a little bit different. And I always like to make sure that I'm paying attention and aware of that as I counsel them through this process. We talk a little bit about early contact and relational trust. I think the relational trust goes again across the board for any student, but the early contact part for me, why I try to lean into that a little bit more, is that sometimes there's opportunities out there that sometimes my students of color might not hear about until they're in their maybe junior or even sometimes their senior year. And a lot of that times that's about around like the curriculum, honors courses, advanced placement courses. And knowing that at the end, for a lot of my students, when they're looking at schools, the schools are looking at rigorous curriculums. And I want to make sure that my students have the opportunity to engage in those classes if they choose to. So early contact to make sure that I'm looking at what is offered to them, what is on their track, and also so I can speak to it once I am beginning to write that letter of recommendation about their curriculum. That also gets into addressing the implicit bias in counseling and the conversation around undermatching. Undermatching is something where, for me, the things that I'm thinking about is, am I understanding my students' accomplishments within context? And sometimes I rely, again, heavily on my college counseling background. But in this particular case, I want to know based off of what we offer and where my students are coming from, their background, their experiences, how does that overlap and how does that either amplify or at least provide a little bit more detail around their accomplishments in high school. So if I have a student who is doing extremely well in an advanced placement course, or a student who might be a little bit worried or concerned about whether they should take an honors or an advanced placement course, I'm always happy to try to connect the dots with teachers to try to dispel those myths and see if we really have a conversation around that. That will help when I am addressing rigor, so I'm not worried about will these schools look favorably around my students' academic curriculum. Cultural competence is something that I think we all have to take a little bit of a step back on and really ask some tough questions about ourselves, our office, and where we're at in our process. I do come into this with the understand or with the kind of mindset that, this process in a lot of ways um, is a little bit different in this context with students who are coming from sometimes marginalized, kind of the minority background. In those cases, there are certain issues that we want to make sure that we're bringing up, certain things that we want to know. We want to know about HSIs and HBCUs, if that could be a really good option for our students. There might be cultural, um, there might be specific scholarship opportunities that are available. There might just be a way and an honor in the way that we talk about differences that we might also need to address to make sure that we are treating these spaces safe and making sure that our students feel comfortable sharing. We know that this process can be very emotional. We know that this process takes in a lot of different elements. And, we do have to be in a counseling hat, really be thoughtful about that. And sometimes that means being open to have maybe sometimes some uncomfortable conversations around identity. But if the student is leaning into that with you, there's an assumed level of trust that's there that I would hope that you would honor back, by again, listening, being open-minded, hearing what they have to say, and being able to encourage and then, as always, advocate for them on the back end. Being able to really support students, reach out for them, have the conversations, make the additional phone calls to a parent or a guardian, just to make sure that their application process is really attuned to and really thinking about their concerns, their experiences, and maybe how their identity would impact their next choices for college. Okay. Next slide, Chad.
Yep.
Perfect. One of the things that we always are visioning when we are looking at opportunities for students to engage with colleges in the fall and even now as we think about summer programs and others visit opportunities, who do we have coming to visit? What information are they sharing? One, we've made a really intentional purpose to encourage HBCUs to attend and come and do campus visits. That is something where we want to make sure our students are seeing the campuses, seeing the communities, have the opportunity to engage. We make sure that students and the counselors are talking about issues around access, not just from a racial standpoint, but also from ability, able-bodied, learning differences, to make sure that they are addressing that in their information sessions that they have on campus. And also being alerted of if there are any free or accessible opportunities for students to come visit campus, fly-in programs, things of that nature that may impact students who might not have the economic means to get to some of and put their feet on some of these campuses. The resources that we try to provide for students, again, covers a little bit of everything, but it's all individualized. Our students have their own stories. And even for me, I have to kind of not make assumptions when I come into a meeting with a student. I have to come in open-minded, that, my student might have two parents that have gone to college, very well situated to make plans for their post-secondary education. So I have to go in just kind of ready to have that conversation and engage, but also understand that the perspective that they're coming from might be a little bit different. As I mentioned, for my experience, um, being a first gen student, being a low income student, being a former student of color, I rely heavily on that to try to connect with the students and really try to make sure that they see that their journey and their process, that there doesn't have to be as many challenges or impediments to it. Just that, if I was thinking about things that tripped me up in the process, I make sure to really highlight that with students. If there were things that I may have tripped up a friend of mine, even things around financial aid, not so much financial aid, that first year, but thinking about retention. Is that scholarship renewable over 4 years? You know what I mean? Will that money continue to come to you, or will we have to go back and find another source of income for sophomore year? Those are the types of details that were helpful for me to know and pick up on the way. And I just try to share that with my students through working with them.
Excellent. We're going to switch over to talking about counseling neurodiverse students. As you can see, neurodiversity is the unique way that people's brains work. And there are no two similar situations when working with students who have neurodiverse learning styles. So it should be, a situation where you're asking a lot of questions and listening about some of the differences that they might be experiencing, everything from ADHD, autism, dyslexia, executive functioning deficits. So you sitting down and learning what students might be experiencing, and then how that might impact their day is really, really important. Not only their day, but also how they go through, school, how they go through their life outside of school. It is really important as you talk to students, once again, as Joaquin was saying, to not make any assumptions about how they might go through this process with any of these common differences that students might experience. In thinking of how you might be able to support students in your office and in your school community, one of the things that's really important is to think about what is your office able to provide in terms of maybe additional supplementary application and essay assistance. Is that anything your office can do, partnering with current or former faculty, or are there ways that you can connect them with resources outside of school? I know that students here maybe also need a longer runway in terms of like getting work done. Those are students who maybe contact us and need extra support in the summer. And that's just something that, maybe they don't ask for, but you willingly provide if that's not something that you do, because if students maybe need a little more time to work through some of these parts of the application in terms of like reading and working their way through the application and writing essays, once again, for them to only get started in the fall of their senior year on some of this, it might put them at a deficit in getting the work done on time. Also guiding students through their accommodations. And if they're not using it, on your campus, they obviously run the risk of maybe not getting access to that on standardized testing and access in college. That's one of the things that we have a learning specialist here on campus. And she is constantly talking to students and parents about that, kind of this use it or lose it mentality, both here on campus and after they graduate from St. Andrews. So that's something that you should also be reinforcing as a college counseling office, so that students are consistently using that throughout high school, because for a lot of students, it's a way that they have maintained the academic successes that they've had. So, making sure that they are aware that, hey, this is a part of the reason why you've been successful here. Let's make sure that you continue to use that here so that you can use it in college. Self-advocacy, I think it's really important for us, for students to, once again, after they leave our campuses where we have touchstones with them and we know them by name, if they go to campuses where there's not someone reaching out to them, how can we encourage them to self-advocate, not only for themselves, with their teachers, but with their accommodations? And, asking questions when they go and visit campuses for college tours, or when they're coming to rep meetings that are happening on your campus. Oftentimes, I know that students may not be open to sharing this information, but I think it's something that, maybe in one-on-one settings or in their conversations as they're having with reps kind of on the early side, seeing what support services exist on the campuses that they're interested in. So I think that's a form of self-advocacy, and making sure that it is, kind of a part of their research if it's not already. And then building a support network. I think that's, once again, something not only for students and families to be aware of, but also our college counseling offices. What access to resources do we have, once again, on and off campus? If we're, encouraging students to work with people who aren't employees on our campus, how are we pointing them in the right direction to find everything from academic tutors to success coaches with executive functioning? What are the ways that we're helping them? And once again, maybe tearing down those barriers to making sure they have kind of access to those if this is something they struggle with. And then, are there people in your local area in terms of staff members and local Office of Disability Services who can be of resource to you in either coming to campus and talking about these things that students should be asking, or just serving as a resource for your families to reach out to ask questions? Once again, maybe it's not a particular school that one of your students is interested in, or maybe it is, but once again, asking questions of professionals who are working with college students in this work as they move on from high school. The last thing that I'll touch on is, having conversations with students and families about the differences between, service centers, disability service centers on campus, and then kind of structured support services. The disability services centers are maybe the places that students turn to get, extra time when taking tests, or, extra tutoring services once they get to campus. But then there are those, very intentional structured support programs like the SALT Center at University of Arizona, where students are kind of embedded in that program across their 4-year experience instead of kind of like an opt-in as needed. So I think explaining to students and families that there are different levels of support, and for them to have a sense of what level they think they might need once they leave high school and go into the college setting. So once again, in the resources that we'll be sending out after this presentation, I'll be sending kind of some examples of different levels of support that students might be interested in, so that they can gauge what they think they might need. And once again, encouraging students and families to stop by these support services offices as they visit campus. I imagine, as I've seen and heard from families, that scheduling an appointment to sit down and talk to someone on campus while you're there is going to be super important for students to not feel like they've been kind of like guided in the wrong direction should they get to a school and then they're like, oh wow, I thought that I was going to get the same level of support that I had at my previous school in college. They need to have that information as early as possible. And then finally, how and if students will self-disclose their diagnosis during their college application process. That's an individual conversation that you may have with students and families. I don't think any of us would say that there's a one-size-fits-all approach to that. Oftentimes students have an inclination of if they want to, because it's a part of their story and their identity, and they want the school to know that about them. And then some students may see it as a way that a school might look to exclude them in the process if they can't offer them support. So there are pros and cons to both. I think all of us could probably come up with a list of for both of those. But once again, that is an individual conversation that students and families will want and should have with you. And I think, as you do maybe your questionnaires with students and families, that can be something that you ask, either for them to reveal either any things about themselves that they are maybe either concerned about, or things that they may want to talk to you about as kind of an additional section. This often comes up for us as a question that students and family ask kind of as they start in the process in junior year, of what are ways that we might either be able to highlight this and let schools know that this is maybe something that has affected my grades, versus how do we hide this? We don't want schools to know that. So once again, we probably all dealt, or we will deal with situations kind of along both of those lines. But these are conversations that you may be having. And I'm going to turn it over to B.
Great. Thanks, Chad. Hi, everyone. B. Hadab-Decker from St. Stephen's Episcopal in Texas. So I'm going to talk a little bit about international student counseling. We're actually one of, I think, the only boarding school in Central Texas. So we do have a good number of, I think, 50 international students in every class from 9 through 12. So we see them quite a bit. But in any case, we wanted to provide some definitions for you as far as who um, is an international student. So here you'll see kind of a basic one. It's, anyone who doesn't have a US passport, who might be in the country on an F1 or a J1 visa. Um, it's worth checking with your international office if you have one, as far as who they consider to be international, or with your admissions office, because they're often involved in the process of classifying students. So, but that's the most a kind of standard definition. In many states, this does not international students does not include undocumented students. So for example, in California, the UCs don't count undocumented students as international. They're considered domestic students for their application process. Their process is a little different in the sense that they fill out a different form for financial aid. But otherwise, they go through the same process as any other domestic student. It is, it's these definitions, they're going to change slightly from state to state and school to school. So that's kind of what makes it tricky about trying to see what the process might look like for your international student, but at least this is kind of some basic groundwork. The second bullet point talks about how the landscape is constantly shifting in this aspect. In Texas recently passed legislation where, in order for an international student to receive in-state tuition, they have had to reside in Texas for 36 consecutive months. So that means they can't leave Texas for the summer and then be in school in Texas for the school year in order to get that in-state tuition. They have to be in Texas for 36 consecutive months before attending college and university. So, and that just was changed last year, I think. So it's something that's constantly changing, and just something to, at least for your own state, to know what the laws are for international students. So it can be a little tricky. But so that leads me kind of to the next point as far as working with your families and your students. For many international students, at least at my school, rankings sort of trump everything. They want to get into the best ranked school, and if they can't get into the best ranked school, they want to get into the best ranked in-state school. And sometimes families kind of think that, at least the ones that I've worked with, um, grades and outcomes are kind of a one-to-one process. If you have these types of grades, you're going to get this type of school, when, as we all know, it doesn't work that way. Um, and and so typically that's the parent perspective, and that's, the student feels that, and it's important to talk with your student to understand what their expectations are, what the parent expectations are, to really educate on, what the process is like in the States, just because it's so different. The application process is so different in the United States compared to other countries around the world. Typically, as you might know, in other countries, you get a certain score on the test, like in China or in India, um, or certain grades, and you get to this type of school, and there really aren't essays involved, interviews, things like that. It's a very straightforward process, and the States is a little different. So, so yeah, so that's a little bit what it looks like for students, international students in your school. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. All right. And for the students who are looking to apply abroad, um, the app process, as I was kind of alluding in the previous slide, is different. So the deadlines will probably be different. For instance, if kids are looking at Oxford or Cambridge, they have an October 15th deadline. Oftentimes outside of that, schools tend to have universities and colleges abroad tend to have later deadlines, which is kind of nice, especially if kids haven't decided if they want to end up applying abroad. But for some schools, it's earlier rather than later, like in our process. Um, and the other thing that's worth noting is that for some schools, you do have to prep, just do the research a little earlier to understand what the requirements are. So at St. Stephen's, for example, we are not an AP school. We do not offer AP classes, or, well, we do give kids the ability to sit for the exams, but no official AP classes. And so for that reason, if a kid is really considering studying in the UK at some of the schools that require AP exams, they have to know that kind of early on to plan their spring and summers to take those exams. So that's one thing. And then for international schools that aren't on Common App or UCAS, sometimes you have to send official documents through snail mail, or you have to fax things in, or you have to get things notarized. So, and that takes time. So it's really important to have those conversations about um, international universities early on. That's something that I tend to ask in sort of those first few meetings when we're thinking about the list, is if they would ever consider studying abroad. It's just good to get that conversation out of the way a little earlier on. That way you're prepared. We're lucky enough at my school to have an international office that's dedicated to working with students on their visas, on their passports, on notarization. And not every school has an international office because they just don't have as big of population as international students that we have. Um, so I think other places that you can check with are definitely the admissions office, just because, again, they worked with them on the front end. They had to have seen, their um, visas or whatever the case may be. And they can really be a resource for you when it comes time to get them to apply. On the right-hand side, you'll see some great resources. UCAS, they have really helpful counselor, or not counselors, admission officers, who get back to you really quick. I've had a lot of really good luck with them, and their presentations during NACAC are also really helpful, especially the writing a reference letter. I remember attending that one and just coming away with the realization that their letters of rec are so different from ours. So that's a really good resource. I've often used the NACAC guide to international university admission. You can just download this from their website. And I think it lists most um, institutions abroad, if not all, and it outlines the application steps. I remember I had a student who was interested in applying to the Netherlands, and that ended up being a really good resource. And of course, there's Facebook. NACAC has special interest groups as well that you can check in on. So, and then of course, your access people. We've all probably have dealt with a student who is thinking about applying to somewhere in Europe or Australia or what have you. And we're happy to help you look into that. So, yeah. All right. Next slide, please. Okay. So in working, I think, with this population, but probably this applies to most populations. Here are some of the potential challenges that you might run into. As I was talking about earlier, a lot of my international families tend to focus on ranking rather than fit, which makes sense. When you think about their own process in their country. Again, they tend to correlate grades with outcomes, and so the higher ranked the university is, the better it must be, regardless if it's a good fit for a kid. And so that's a conversation that I have a lot with families, is just having them understand, what does fit mean? It can mean a lot of things: affordability, location, access of major, whatever the case. That's something that you might run into a lot. Parents tend to be involved in choosing the major. You might hear the stereotype of lawyer, engineer, or doctor, and that's part of our job, to help them understand that the world has changed a lot, and there are so many ways to get into the career or field that the student wants to. Um, the financial piece too is tricky, especially as an international student. And I think this is where having just access to previous students' app process is helpful. So I'm working with two girls from Jamaica this year, and they're in a weird spot where they are able to, they just don't qualify for financial aid on paper, even though they could, it would be tremendously helpful. And so just finding those schools where we know that that the schools would be amenable to giving them financial aid regardless of however the FAFSA is presenting, not the FAFSA, the CSS profile in their case, because they can't fill out a FAFSA since they're international students, or just knowing the schools that have good merit money, and then working with the families to help them understand that these are great schools. Maybe they've never heard of them, but there's a lot of money there. So it's things like that that you'll just need that you'll probably face. And then the other thing is too, I think the use of outside counselors is really common. Um, it's just for many students, it's a part of the process. And it has nothing to do with your ability to counsel or their trust or faith in you. It's just kind of how it's done in their country. And so that can be tricky, is sort of juggling what the counselor is saying and the list that they're building versus the list that you're building. So the fun of it all. And I think there's one more slide. Okay. So how do we help families, each other overcome these challenges? Well, mostly families. It's a lot of just repeating the same thing over and over and over again. Talking about fit versus ranking, talking about merit money at schools they've never heard of, talking about how in one state you might qualify for in-state tuition, in another you might not. I mean, it's just saying the same things over and over again. Um, if you've had international students go through the app process at your school, relying recruiting them to help you talk with these families and share their stories, because of course they probably trust you and I have a lot of faith in the process with you, but hearing it from a peer just it resonates a little differently. I think oftentimes too, we might see students, international students in particular, really focus on those grades and those classes and the standardized tests. And so it kind of leaves them a little one-dimensional. And as we know, in the States, the app process kind of looks for multi-dimensional students. So we want to encourage them to be involved in extracurriculars, take part in community service, and then, have them visit as many different colleges as possible. Again, just to kind of broaden their horizons about the app process in the States. Okay, so with that said, I think I'm going to hand it over to Chad.
Yes, me again. Also, I don't know if I introduced myself. I'm so sorry. I'm Chad Fulton. I'm at St. Andrew's Episcopal School in Austin, Texas, right down the road from B. The last group that we're going to touch on today is first generation students, and similar once again to some of the same points that you've heard about other students and different identities that you might be working with, is partnering with or for first generation families is to start early and starting maybe to partner with your colleagues in the school's admissions office. As B said, they've worked with them kind of on the front end of things, and there may be things that have helped, or they may know that can assist you in working with parents and students of first generation with first generation backgrounds. once again, you may be able to get some of this information from a survey that you ask students and families to complete, or it may be something that comes out later on in the process. This was a question that we did ask for a number of years and then removed it, and it may be coming back. It's just a kind of a sensitive question to ask, maybe. Where'd you go to college? And for people maybe to potentially reveal that's not something that they did. So you will know what's best for you and your population of students, and if that's something that you ask. Programming also focused on transition for first generation students is always really helpful. Sometimes it's also really helpful for them to see other people, maybe that they know teachers, people in leadership at your school who were first generation, and to hear about their stories. And once again, to see like this is not something that is going to limit you. So I think faculty and staff as resources and other programming. If there are, once again, local colleges and universities that have offices that work with first-gen students coming to do a presentation about just like things that they should be aware of as they move from high school to college, or just things for them to look for in their college application search, that could be really, really helpful, both once again for students and for parents. Interest in pre-collegiate programs specific to first generation populations. I think a lot of colleges have moved to kind of expanding their fly-in programs to include students of all different types of backgrounds. So I think as you see those things, once again, in terms of summer programs, fly-in opportunities for students, or just, opportunities for students to get on campus, I think the more you can encourage students to be a part of those programs, it's super helpful. We actually have a couple of students who are a part of Breakthrough Austin here at St. Andrews, and they work with them to do everything from, additional college visits over the summer, maybe during times that we're not offering any. They take students to different programs, during the school year, and they also offer just like a different layer of support for first-gen students. So once again, finding those local partnerships as well, and then just being mindful that not all of the cases of first-generation students are the same. Not making any assumptions about what they might need or how you might work with them. I believe as Joaquin mentioned, like making assumptions about there could be students who have parents who did not attend college but also are on track to get all of this work done, and kind of know some of the ins and outs, even if it's not something that they participated in either here in the United States or at all. So not making any assumptions as you continue to work with these students. Once again, I think the resources that you are able to provide students, or the additional resources that you can point parents and students to either on or off campus, are going to be very, very helpful and important. And then, kind of getting in front of them early and establishing some of that relationship, or establishing a relationship, is also going to be really, really important. And those are all of the kind of the groups that we wanted to talk about today. We imagine there may be some questions that you have. You can feel free to either drop those in the chat, or I believe we're a small enough group. If you want to unmute yourself and just ask a question, we'll try to answer it as best we can.
Hi, I'm Mara. Thank you guys so much. This has been really helpful. I work over at Watkinson School in Hartford, and we have a wide variety of students. And surprisingly, for a day school, we have a large number of international students, many from China. And so I was relating very much to the rank over fit. And one of the perks that we have is also our Watkinson's a very progressive school. And so we what we teach is like the opposite of the SAT. So our kids don't do very well traditionally on the SAT. So you have kids that are coming from get the test scores, get the grades, take the AP classes to a small day, progressive day school in Hartford where we don't have APs, we don't have honors. We tell them to reflect versus memorize, and parents expect these, you know, the Ivies. And we also don't have a ton of communication with parents, which is, I think I'm new, so I'm still getting used to that. And I don't know if it's a language barrier, or we definitely have communication from their independent counselors, but we don't hear from the parents very often. So I think it's a lot of, I feel like the kids get stuck in the middle a lot, and we're trying to educate, but I think we're repeating the same things to the kids, who then repeat to their parents, who then hear, no, this is what you need to do. If there's any, even like a cheat sheet of colleges that may look really good on paper for international students, that they might be able to get into. I don't know. I don't know what I'm looking for. It's just maybe any advice or ways that you have found success.
That's a that's a great question. And yeah, I mean, same thing. It is rare for me to talk with the parents, same in Texas as well. If I have any communication with the family about their app process, usually the agent or the counselor is the one who's responding. So, but I think that might be a good question to throw out to the Access group, to see if they've had, if there's a default list of schools. If you want to email me after, I'm happy to send some schools that I've suggested for kids that have seemed to be acceptable. Even though anyway, that's a whole another conversation. But yes, yeah, happy to connect after. But yeah, definitely use your community here.
Question. Any other questions? Yes, we will be sure to include as many resources as possible. And if there are other things that we can add, I'll just make it kind of just like a running document that we can go back and add once everyone gets access to it. So check back, there may be something there that you weren't looking for and now you need it. So when we send out the recording, we'll be sure to include like I said, a running Google Doc that everyone who registered for this webinar will receive. So if you have things that you would like us to add, you can email us, or if there are other things that you know right now, go ahead and share them and we'll make sure that they get added immediately. We want to spread the wealth and also, maybe not send everyone down an internet research rabbit hole if we don't have to. So I think that's one of the beautiful things about Access is the information that we all kind of collectively share. But I believe we're at time. And thank you all so much for joining us. We hope to see you next month. And once again, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or need anything from us. Take care.